About a year ago, I was asked to what I wanted to talk about as part of this presentation. I thought, well, what an interesting topic, because I was actually dealing with an organisation that had an interesting challenge. They were wanting to change their business model, and they kind of looked at that for over 2 years, and then they lost a very substantial amount of their funding, and all of a sudden that idea of changing their business model went away, and they went into protective mode. And they had to protect what they had, and all of those wonderful ideas about innovating their business had changed. And so the idea of actually innovating our business model and actually changing our relationship with money is really what I want to talk about today. And I'm not really going to talk much about specific case studies within the cultural industries at all, and I'm doing that purposely because I think there's so much that's happening in the world beyond our cultural world, and we've seen plenty of these today. Is that I want to talk about other industries and the things that we should be actually looking towards from other industries and learning from them, because I think that's an incredibly important thing. And so I'm going to go into a number of cases and to look at that. But I think firstly, just to look at some of the darker or some of the bigger challenges that we face in terms of why we need a better relationship with money. And I'm not going to speak specifically about money, but some of the things that give us a better relationship with money. And these are some quotes that I've sort of come across over the last couple of years when I've been talking to people that are particularly memorable. We lost a significant proportion of our funding. We're told the game has changed. The game can change very quickly. And if the game changes and it's not in your control, then how do you become equipped to be able to deal with that quickly? To be quite honest, the game changes for everyone. But if you become beholden to any one organisation or a funding body that actually changes the game on you, how exposed are you to that and how do you respond to that? Or do you simply wait and see what happens, which is, I think, what a number of organisations do and find themselves in significant challenge. Many a times I've heard, we can't do that. That would put us outside of our funding agreement. If your funding agreements are actually holding you back, a very serious question has to be asked is that really good for the future of your organisation? How do we actually look at what the plan B is? Post-GFC, corporate money has gotten tougher to come by. Another economic downturn, it won't get any easier. And they will happen because they're cyclical. Our audiences are growing old and dying, literally. If you're in certain performing arts areas, that is true. But it's like, let's hang on to them, but what about all these millions of other people we're not talking to? We don't know enough about them. Why not? It's hard, we don't know them, get to know them because they're going to be your future, or they may not be a participant at all. And I think fewer and fewer audiences are committing to subscriptions, so we need to hang on to them. That's kind of a little odd because it's a shrinking world. And while subscription models are working for a lot of other industries, it tends to be more of a challenge in this industry. And so again, all of these things are suggesting that we need to seriously reconsider sort of some of the models that we use. On top of that, just to make things more challenging, we have very large systemic challenges, but this is again not new to this industry, this is a global thing. As I mentioned, we're kind of in a 100-year cycle here in terms of the kind of massive shift. And that is the tech revolution, the shift from agrarian to industrial to technology. Of course, the way our models will work will need to be rewired because you can't simply think an industrial model, which is essentially what most of our organisations are built around, in how they're structured and how they work, is not going to be relevant actually to a future that we live in. The government talks more and more about a fiscal gap, so if we are reliant on government funding, I don't think it will get much easier. In fact, it will get significantly harder. Any of the current long-range planning documents that the Australian government talks about up to 2050 is talking about that fiscal gap widening. The need, for example, even in healthcare, the funding in healthcare will need to double by 2050, and it's starting from now forward. Now, what I think about in that context is that if health funding needs to double and we have a gap in terms of revenue that government actually can bring in but have to spend more, who's going to have to lose out? What's going to be acceptable to the public in terms of who loses out? Now, my guess is that if health funding needs to double and the public is going to have to make a choice, I suspect the public will choose health over culture, which is going to be a big problem, particularly as the population ages and they'll want to be taken care of. So it's pretty significant. And then lastly, I think technology, but just generally, we talk a lot about millennials and the early generations that are coming up. Their view of culture is very different, and the way they consume culture and the way they think about it is very different. And so us framing culture to them and presenting it to them And they don't necessarily see a demarcation between culture and the other things they do in their own life. And so that lack of demarcation means that our engagement with them needs to be very different. And so the combination of all of these things on top of, I guess, the natural things within our own organisations are going to provide us with a really interesting set of challenges for the future. And so what I want to talk about is actually how we may go about resolving some of those. I think Kim Williams in his Cultural Futures speech late last year sort of made this point really well. The notion of periods of stability and static movement followed by modest incremental change or bursts of invention have vanished. The evidence of this revolution is everywhere. Incrementalism is a historical facet of 20th century culture, not of now. So let's wait and see how this world plays out is not likely to be something that's going to be particularly useful in terms of the way we drive our organisations. We have to set clear and radical ambitions for our organisations, and we have to execute them quickly. Otherwise, we will, I guess, confront many challenges that I've already talked about. And just to give you a sense of what's happening with organisations and their models, and I've built the 20th century models typically and how organisations run, which is the old industrial model, and then what we're starting to see with other organisations, and some we'll talk about shortly. And you can see a very dramatic shift, and from the industrial world to the infotech world, the stable state world, which was relatively predictable, we could see what was happening to actually a fluid state world, which is unpredictable. That focus less on shareholder or in cultural institutions, different stakeholders that actually influence our income. To customers, from stewardship of our organisations and protection of what we need to do, to actually looking for better alternatives and actually finding them off our own bat rather than waiting to see what happens. That we're less focused on planning and more on the principles of how an organisation should work. Less about being top-down and siloed and hierarchical and all that kind of stuff that often is difficult for organisations to run, to being systemic and connected. And it's not simply within an organisation, but connected outside as well. That we focus less on policies, procedures, processes, which is the stuff that typically runs organisations, to being culturally driven, to hiring the right people who understand how this thing needs to work naturally and who can adapt to fast change. This is all the stuff when we talk about resilience is what is now being built into certain organisations. And this is the stuff that we need to make strong cultural organisations. We don't simply wait for the market to tell us what to do, we actually create our own future. And I think one of the interesting challenges with a lot of arts organisations that I focus in is that I think, in the arts, I think we expect to find innovation on the stage or on a wall or in an exhibition. We often don't expect to see it back at the office in terms of our boards or our leadership and what have you. And I know that's not the case for every organisation, but it is the case for a lot. And I think we actually have to put the creativity and the innovation that we expect of artists into the way we run our businesses and we manage them. And I think there's certainly room for improvement. This was a study that was done last year. The culture sector least likely to have an innovation strategy out of any not-for-profit sector. To be quite honest, I actually think these numbers are really high. I actually don't believe a lot of organisations have any innovation strategy and certainly don't document it or execute it. I certainly don't see it in private enterprise a lot. I actually think these numbers are pretty high, which would be great if it's true, but I'm not really sure. So how do we change our relationship with money? Well, we don't focus on the money is probably one of the rules. It's the things that you do around it that get you that actually matters the most. And so, as I said, I'm not going to focus a lot on arts examples. I'm going to talk about other industries that are doing things that are probably a lot more emergent, a lot more radical, because I think they're a market of the kind of things that we can learn from and we should be studying. And normally when I go and talk to cultural organisations, I often don't talk a lot about actually their industry. I tend to talk about what's happening in other places because there's some pretty interesting stuff that's going on. And so when we talk about innovation, we often, and a lot of it's been discussed around how we look at brand or how do we engage with customers and create new experiences. And I think some of the ways that we can actually engage in terms of new product systems, and I think even creating a festival is actually re-engaging sort of how people see, I guess, a suite of products. But what we often forget about are the things about the configuration of our organisation. If we walk into work, we just assume this structure is a natural way that things should be done, and I think we need to even question that. Is our business model actually right and resilient for the future? Is the network structure right? Is our organisation actually built to change if something dramatic and radical happens in terms of an opportunity or a challenge? And are our processes right, or should we be rethinking those? So I'm going to touch on 6 examples of those as a way of, I guess, rethinking ways of innovating the nature of our organisation. Nothing I'm going to talk about here is something you can take away tomorrow and do, to be quite honest. This is hard stuff. And that's why it rarely gets done. That's why that organisation I mentioned at the start spent 2 years navel-gazing about doing the hard thing, and then it got harder for them. Because it's tough, and that's why it's rare that organisations execute this well. Firstly, the idea of creating deep connections with our audiences, and this comes to the point about data, but actually, finding if our subscription audiences are disappearing, or the audience we once knew is vanishing. Well, how do we re-engage? How do we understand at a deep level? And probably one of the best examples of any organisation that I know of is this one that most people would well and truly recognise now. What we probably don't recognise in Australia is that they started as a company that basically rented DVD movies to people through the post and pivoted their business, which in itself was a radical transformation. Now, most people would argue that Netflix, the reason for their success is the massive content that they have, but it's not only that, it's actually the connection that they make with the audience, which is pretty remarkable. They have a recommendation engine which they spend about $150 million a year on, and I know none of us has that sort of money, but it's the intent or the principle of this that's important, is that recommendation engine is what drives 75% of the content consumption. It's not actually having the marquee pieces that they have only. And what do? Well, I think the really important thing is that the people who actually tag those films have a very important job to do. They have a 34-page document that they have to know well and truly in terms of how they do their tagging, because they actually see that tagging as a fundamentally important part of the data management and understanding audience behaviour. So, most of the film industry would look at genres like this: action, comedy, sci-fi, etc., etc. The way Netflix sees it, and this is where the tagging comes into do, is that they have roughly 78,000 genres, which is a really smart innovation in terms of how they think about audience interactions. This is an example of just a small number of them, otherwise I'd be here all day if I showed you all of them. So witty independent comedies, cult evil kid horror movies, travel movies starring William Hartnell, critically acclaimed emotional independent dramas, irreverent werewolf movies of the 1960s. We all laugh at these, but these are actually incredibly important because this is what drives the recommendation engine, because it at a granular level knows the behaviour at a very, very small level. And it's actually really making that effort to understand audiences fundamentally important for them. And I think that's where, and you can know that this is starting to be successful, is where the people, our audiences, start to play off and the brand actually enters the culture. And this is where you get people on Twitter going, I'll just watch some Netflix before bed and it's 4 a.m. Or David over here, when he's asked to count his blessings, Netflix comes before mummy, daddy, or his sister Sarah. You can see that this is where there's real connection that's happening with an audience, and it's above and beyond just simply selling content in its generic form. And that is why, partly why, Netflix massively outperforms the other players in this country. It's not just about content, it's about understanding. 5 minutes! Okay, I'm going to have to move really fast. Okay, a more advanced view of risk. I think this is something most organisations in Australia need to focus on very substantially. Is that often risk is seen as a fearful thing, is that we have to protect. It is hugely problematic in terms of actually a world that is high in risk. And so we have to ask ourselves a bigger question, is that what is the greater risk, to hang on to what isn't working or to look for a radically better alternative? And now I think we're at a point where actually it is much more risky to hold on to what we have in a lot of cases, particularly when you look at so many organisations that are faced with long-term challenges. We need to find better alternatives, and technology is often providing that. I won't go into a lot of these details, but all of these are organisations that have very, very different starting points to where they are today. And in the case of companies like IBM and Apple and even Airbnb, they gave up massive opportunities to actually have the opportunity they have now. IBM gave up its PEC business, which was the largest in the world, sold it off. We wouldn't often give up something that we saw as advantageous, but it was fundamental to them actually finding that better thing. Culture is now, or it should be considered as the operating system. It shouldn't be something that's the nice soft thing for the HR department to manage. It is essential to driving success. A few years ago, The Economist talked about the Montessori School of Management, which was a response to how Google's model is very different. And Google talks about the fact that they create the conditions for collaboration, discovery and creativity through their culture. That's how they drive innovation. MailChimp is a very similar one, in that they actually demand that they hire weird people. They hire people outside of their category. They want fresh blood. They want fresh thinking, because that's what actually drives the industry. So how many people in the cultural world actually decides consciously to hire people from banking, from technology, from all other areas that could actually provide a very different view of how we go to market with what we need to do? A clear point of view around the world. At the last conference that I was at for Korean, I actually put up a slide that showed the vision and values for most arts organisations in Australia, and they're almost all identical. And that's why I think, and again I keep coming back to this as an example, and you've heard it done to death, but I'm going to say it again, is that David Walsh talks about Mona as being a subversive adult Disneyland. That's his view of the world, about how that should be, how he actually sees art and how he wants to present it. But it also provides him with a frame of reference for what he wants to achieve beyond simply the gallery. And that's why he can add his music festival in, the books, the gallery, the winery, the brewery, the restaurant, and his talk about the casino, which I think is on hold for now, as new sources of revenue that actually have a natural logic for that viewpoint. And I would encourage every organisation to go back to their vision and values and go, does this sound like everybody else? And does this actually sound like the normal policy thing that we need? Not exactly the ideal thing. I think in terms of making decisions and actually developing a brand that is distinctive and unique is fundamental. A new model for doing business. I'll go back. One of the most common shifts I think that we're starting to see now is the shift from necessarily just the pure commercial enterprise or the pure not-for-profit to the social enterprise. And I think this is an area that will grow substantially over time. And this is, I've left the long copy here, you can read it as you go if you like, because I think it's really interesting. Warby Parker is a commercial enterprise that's shifting sort of towards the social. And the fact that they very succinctly talk about their new business model. They were founded on a rebellious spirit and a lofty objective to offer designer eyewear to at a revolutionary price, while leading the way for social conscious businesses. This is really important for them, is that essentially Luxottica owns about 80% of the eyewear market, and they said we can break that model, we can change our channels, we can actually develop a solution. Instead of paying $400 or $500 for eyewear, we can do it for $100. Not only can we do that, but for every glass that we sell to somebody commercially, we can give away a pair of glasses to somebody in need somewhere in the world. And so they've quite literally given away millions and millions of these things. And so their business isn't purely set on commercial grounds, that they can do a lot more. On the flip side, in not-for-profits, very similarly, I believe that more and more not-for-profits can shift into the social enterprise area. This is 826 Valencia, which is a literacy organisation that was started by David Eggers. 826 Valencia is the street and the address of their organisation, which is based in San Francisco. When they took that rent to actually provide literacy programs to school kids, they didn't know that they actually needed to offer a product in a store. Because they were told, well, you can't just offer literacy things, it doesn't fit with the council regulations. And so they started what David described as the first independently owned pirate supply store in San Francisco. And interestingly, that pirate supply store that sells things like bead extensions and messages in bottle and what you do with missing limbs and things like that, that kind of novelty is actually a very profitable enterprise. It's in fact profitable enough to be able to sustain a lot of the rest of the business. And again, it's like the question is that should not-for-profits really be considering themselves not-for-profits? Or are there other things that we can do that actually can make us substantially profitable, that can drive a whole much more things? This is extended across the US, into the UK with the Ministry of Stories, and now into Australia with the Martian Embassy as well. I don't know how successful they are, but certainly a really interesting model for the future. And then lastly, understanding our impact, and I'll be very quick with this because I think David Redhill's already talked about this, is that, again, to be able to understand our cultural contribution, to be able to understand and argue in society of the value that we provide, this is incredibly important. And you can see David's study of Sydney Opera Houses, which is when I was working at Sydney Opera House a couple of years ago. That's where I first met David and talked about the study. But more recently, we worked with Screen Australia to talk about actually the kind of economic impact that Australian film provides. And the Australian government's focused pretty much on box office. That's all I want to talk about. Well, the film industry provides a lot more than that, and we kind of know that, but we need to build up an argument for that. And interestingly, Deloitte have been, I think my understanding is they've been appointed to actually look at that. But I actually kind of think for the whole industry to mount an argument to government and to the public more generally and to have a debate is that these kind of arrangements with organisations that are very powerful with using economic modelling is incredibly important, either at an industry level or an individual organisation level, to understand this argument about the real value contribution that we provide is important. And I think it's something that we will need to become more attuned to in the future if we're going to argue our case for our industry and for our success and to actually continue funding. And so I guess that's kind of 6 key themes that I think are worth thinking about in terms of our future and the way we think about our organisations. And I think the point came earlier about we need to question everything. Question your business model, question your culture, question your product mix, question actually how we take things to market. In the tech sector, there's a term that's called the unicorns, which is the organisations that reach $1 billion valuation. And I'm not talking about arts organisations necessarily aiming for that, but the thing that define them are ones that they set a new vision for the world and are proving that there are alternative models for how we can go to market that we never dreamed of. And I think in the arts world, we live and breathe a world of creativity. We need to start considering more and more seriously, okay, what are the new models for us? How can we be the unicorns for the future that others look towards? Because I think that'll make for an incredibly interesting future, and one where we're not fearful, but we're excited for what we can do and what we can achieve. Thank you.
This was a really great talk to finish, our morning about business models. So, but it's at the same time, I feel really, there is a lot to do. So where should we start? I mean, next week when we go back to the office, where should we start? You say, we change the model. So how can we do that?
I think always for me, where I start with an organisation is like just list your gripes that you've got about how things work. Because often those tension points are kind of the world telling you that that's where the problem is, and then start to think about, okay, well, how do we make that better? Whether it's, and you could take one example. There's often talk about, okay, well, how do we serve our customers better? And I do think, and it came up here before, and this might be sort of a bigger thing, but the idea of shared services. I actually think that's one thing this industry needs to seriously consider. Shared services, which is, because most organisations, you'll have a back office, you'll have accounting, you'll have some kind of a box office function. There's a whole bunch of functions that organisations, use, and they're common, and essentially they do the same thing. I strongly believe that in the future that probably more and more arts organisations, for example, will need to consider coming together and actually having a universal set of those skills rather than having them individually. And so I start to think about, well, what kind of relationships, I guess, that you already have with similar arts organisations that you can cultivate, what kind of things that you can learn from them, what kind of conversations you can start to open up to actually, I guess, help understand where the shared things are and where the similarities are for a much bigger conversation in the future about how to integrate. And this is nothing new. In the communications industry, that was done decades ago. Is that you take a whole bunch of creative agencies and you put them together, and then what you do is you put a backbone of technology and HR and all the other admin stuff in there, but then you've got 40, 50 businesses all working off that. Far more efficient model to be able to work to.
So we come back to relationship again.
It's starting with that, understanding the connections and then sort of building your way out from that.